While disfranchisement laws are being passed in the South, 1890s, there's also a move toward Jim Crow. Now, that's a term you may have heard, Jim Crow, right? Well, what it really refers to, of course, is segregation. Particular patterns of segregation is practiced over multitudes of local communities, not only in the South, but in other parts of the United States as well. After the Civil War, race relations had been somewhat fluid. That is to say that they weren't simply written down. We refer to that as de facto. It's just the way it was. Certain customs developed in certain places. But over the decades following the Civil War and following Reconstruction, state governments and local governments will move to put segregation into law to ensure that those customs, those habits regarding public accommodation, education, whatever it may be, that those are put into law and they become what we call de jure. Jure being, of course, a root for instance, jurisprudence, the law. You may recall that some of those earlier cases I had mentioned are bound up with this question of the 14th Amendment and being a citizen of the United States. You may recall as well that laws were passed during Reconstruction, including the Civil Rights Act, which looked at this very topic of access to public accommodation, things like railroad cars, that you wouldn't be treated differently because of the color of your skin, but treated as a citizen like any other citizen. The court and public practice by the 1880s had again begun to narrowly restrict the meaning of these amendments. The result is that we move toward de jure segregation, what we call Jim Crow, and both races are moved toward separation. In 1896, you're probably familiar with an important court case, Supreme Court case, Plessy v. Ferguson. Without going into too much detail, this was a test case of laws regarding segregation, specifically segregation related to public transportation and the railroads. The key figure is Homer Plessy. And what he's going to do is to buy a ticket that should get him a first-class ride. But as he moves into the South, as he moves across borders, custom demands that African Americans be removed from first class, even if they've bought a ticket, and placed in second class, which is dirtier. It's where white men go to chew and spit tobacco. It's just not first class. Now, the law had held that separate but equal was acceptable. Plessy seeks to challenge this notion, partly because the equal is what's missing here. A second-class tobacco-stained car just isn't what he paid for. The Supreme Court, in its decision in 1896, upholds separate but equal. And that, in essence, becomes the doctrine for the land. But in practice, as Plessy well knew, it's simply not a reality. Separate and equal don't happen because people aren't treated equally. The Plessy decision both reflects, reinforces, and expands Jim Crow, both in the South and across the nation. It will come to apply to toilets, bathrooms, so that you must have separate but seldom equal, to where one sits on a streetcar or a bus, to the separation of donated blood during the Second World War, hospitals, asylums, and access to them, even if they are bought with state funds. And in Atlanta, Georgia, in the courts, separate Bibles on which to swear the oath before taking the stand. Race mattered in the Philippines. Ideas about one's race mattered in the United States, in the lower 48. And my argument simply is that when we think about imperialism, perhaps we need to turn back and think about the U.S. itself. It's not the exception, this expansion abroad. It's a continuation in many ways of sentiments and ideas that are already present in the U.S. itself and in its history. A couple more really quick things to add here. Not too long before the Spanish-American War in 1898, there had been a major event in South Dakota. The relationship between Euro-Americans and then U.S. citizens and native people, well, that relationship had been tortured and tortuous, and it had gone on for hundreds of years. In the years following the American Civil War, remember, you'd had the Indian Wars of the Great Plains, so-called. In 1876, the defeat of George Armstrong Custer's 7th Cavalry. It's kind of ironic that among those soldiers who were serving in Cuba were Buffalo soldiers, African Americans who served in the United States military in the West. But in 1890, in South Dakota, an event occurred which I think is very telling. You see, by 1890, the Plains Indians had by and large been reduced to living on reservations. And I can't help but think of the equation, the parallel you can draw between what we saw in Cuba under Spanish rule, when Cuban revolutionaries, Cuban citizens, in fact, were held in limited spaces. They were concentrated in camps so they could be pacified. And then in the Philippines, it turns out the United States, to put down that insurgency, will turn to similar policies, placing Filipino citizens into restricted enclaves and camps in the midst of a jungle war. Well, arguably, back here in the U.S., Native peoples had been placed in their own camps. It had happened before, of course, with the Trail of Tears, hadn't it? Before tribes like the Cherokees were moved west. But here on the reservations of South Dakota, they can't hunt the buffalo, which have largely been wiped out. A way of life, a culture, is coming to an end, or at least being threatened. Maybe that's the best way to say it. Well, in 1890, at the Pine Ridge Reservation of the Sioux Indians, a new idea has been introduced, the so-called ghost dance. It suggests, I think, in some ways, the very desperation of the Sioux, that they would turn to a mystical belief that dancing could restore what had been lost, that it could protect them from the weapons of the U.S. military. So they dance. And it begins to bring about fear among those who guard the Sioux. Many of the Sioux are moving off the reservation. They're leaving, which they're not really supposed to do. And lo and behold, Sitting Bull is shot and killed. Sitting Bull, who had been at Custer's defeat at the Little Bighorn. The United States military turns its attention to bringing in those Sioux who have left the reservation, who are camped just beyond the limits of the reservation. And they find a group of Sioux, and what happens next is nothing less than a sort of massacre. An act of violence leads to the U.S. military firing sort of at will into men, women, and children, old men, young men, children. Some 300 Sioux are pretty much shot down with Hotchkiss guns and rifles. Because of a blizzard, their bodies are left to freeze. And 3 days after the event, after the killing, when soldiers come to bury the bodies, they find them wrenched into gruesome shapes, gruesome forms by the cold. Wounded Knee, as the event comes to be known, Wounded Knee is, to my mind, parallel. It reflects the sentiments of race. And part of the sentiments of race and part of what will maintain order over race, control over race, for all the talk of William McKinley and others about uplift and Christianization, ultimately is what we see in the jungles of the Philippines. It's force. It's what we saw at Wounded Knee, and it's what we see behind segregation and disfranchisement in the form of terror. The fear that on any given day or any given night, people would ride up to your house, pull you from your bed, threaten or kill your family, and kill you. I'm talking, of course, about lynching. In 1897, statistics that were collected by the Tuskegee Institute and later would be collected by the NAACP and other organizations. 1897, it suggested that there were as many as 158 lynchings. Lynchings of both whites and blacks, but predominantly African Americans. In 1898, the year of the Spanish-American War, 120 lynchings across the United States. And a lynching is simply the use of extra-legal violence. It's pulling someone out of prison before they've had a chance to have a trial, which is a right of a citizen in this country, and stringing them up, hanging them, shooting them, maiming them. Violence, terror, and death.